I'd like to echo Carla's words about acknowledging the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri people here. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Gardiner and Gardinjari people who spent time on Karta, which we now know as Kangaroo Island. And they've got an ongoing association with Kangaroo Island, despite the fact that official colonial history really only started in 1836. It's pretty clear that people from the mainland had been using Karta for at least 25,000 years. And I should also mention the Tasmanian women from the Nuunoan people of Bruny Island, who were taken to Karta in the early 19th century as concubines and slaves, and their blood actually runs strong in many of the islanders today. Anyway, so today I'd like to talk about the geoheritage of Kangaroo Island. It's one of the largest islands of Australia. It's about 400,000 hectares, about 50 kilometres wide. So I'll start off by saying a little bit about geoheritage and why it might matter, why it's important to people, and then a little bit about the geology of Kangaroo Island and how it's evolved. Take a look at what's been done so far in terms of the Geoheritage Register in South Australia as it applies to Kangaroo Island, and then look at some, and we'll sort of move into a bit of a travelogue about cave and karst sites on the island that I think could be of importance and worth going on the register. And then a bit about what happened with the bushfires in early 2000 and what the effects of that have been. So can you hear me okay at the back? Thanks. So geoheritage is really about the geodiversity that's of significance to people, and for purposes that don't diminish their intrinsic or ecological values. And so it really implies a distinction between the more utilitarian resource values of rocks, lands, forms and soils, and their conservation values as heritage in their own right. And geodiversity it's really the variety of geological elements, rocks and minerals, soils, fossils, landforms, and most importantly, the ongoing geomorphological processes. Whoops, wrong way, sorry about that. That's better. So why does geoheritage matter? Well, firstly, it provides us with good scientific evidence for past environments and I guess the evolution of life on Earth. It's therefore of importance for research and education. Provides us with a whole range of features that inspire us because of their aesthetics. It's the wow factor. They're features that are important for tourism and recreation. And they're important as the basis of landscapes that have contributed to the sense of place of particular human communities, the places that we call home or that are dear to our hearts. And also features that are quite important for the cultural or spiritual values of communities. So, for example, sacred caves or sacred mountains, such as 7 sacred mountains for Buddhist pilgrimage in China, sort of thing. So if we sort of contrast geodiversity and biodiversity, so biodiversity, we're talking about its importance in illustrating evolutionary processes, the importance of places as refugia for endangered species, factors to do with biogeography and isolation, which is particularly relevant for Australia and places like Kangaroo Island, for species diversity and for research. Whereas geodiversity, well, we can think about the evolution of the Australian landscape in case of caves and karst, paleokarst. So in Australia, we have paleokarst, ancient caves, for example, at Genolan Caves in New South Wales. We have cave fills and cave passages that are around about 380 million years old. And we can get some information of what the environments might have been like at that time. We're interested in the complexity of the hydrology of limestone areas, limestone karsts. Also, there's complexity and variation in the types of bedrocks in which karst features are developed, karst geomorphology and its processes, and so it's important for research. So if we decide that geoheritage is kind of important, then there's some issues to do with the practical implementation. So we really need to identify what are the significant elements of geodiversity. And usually it's kind of a process of inventory, sieving procedure, usually based on some kind of theme. For example, we might be interested in caves in coastal dune limestone, or we might be interested in there's a rich array of caves in tropical tower karsts in Northern Australia, but which areas are really significant. So in terms of developing an inventory, you might start by developing or adopting some existing classification scheme for a particular theme that you've identified, and then you start to gather available data, do some field work to identify all the possible examples of a particular theme, and then compare the examples within a theme to try and tease out the best expressed or developed examples. And this is where expert opinion is very useful. So, for example, back in the 2000s, we had a whole series of workshops in Canberra to try and develop a sieving methodology for identifying what were really the most significant examples of particular landform types in Australia. And we were told that we kicked it off with looking at caves and karst, and we identified a number of themes. And there was a very senior bureaucrat from the environment department there, and we sort of idly asked, well, how many places can we have? And she said, oh, about 200. And we said, oh, that just for caves and karst. Oh, she said, no, that's for the whole of Australia, for everything. Now the minister doesn't want more than 200, can't manage it. So expert opinion is important. And the other way, of course, is to use some kind of numerical index to score the themes and provide some kind of semi-quantitative index. And Sue White and Zoe Wakeland-King have done some work on that, mainly in the arid zone, trying to identify the best arid zone geomorphology. I'm not particularly wrapped in that approach myself. I'm not convinced that, despite the fact of being a child of the quantitative revolution in geography back in the 70s, I'm not convinced that's actually the best way to do it. But okay, it's a valid approach. So, moving on to the geology of Kangaroo Island. So the Kangaroo Island is basically underlain by Cambrian sandstones and meta-sandstones and siltstones, and that's the rock type that shows up in green on that map. And so there's quite a bit of it on the north coast of the island, and there are also exposures of those Cambrian rocks in the middle of the island where valleys are deeply incised into the landscape. The centre of the island, which is in the can only call beige kind of colour, is a deeply weathered lateritic plateau, which was mostly formed in the late Miocene and Pliocene, and has got very deep, well-drained soils, which today support a lot of agriculture. And so the surface of much of that plateau has a lot of ferrocrete and ironstone nodules or pisolites, and the dirt roads, of course, are carpeted with these ball bearings, which that have often caused the tourists to run off the road. The red feature that's, not sure if I can, oh yeah, that works. So this red feature that goes right across there, the northern part of the island, is a massive thrust fault, Snelling fault, which runs for the best part of 100 kilometres, and it's expressed as a bit of a jump up in the landscape. And we'll be looking at one cave that's actually on that fault line. The purple is Pleistocene dune limestone, most closely analogous to the Bridgewater Formation in coastal Victoria. It looked like it's formed over four periods of higher sea levels during the Pleistocene, in the interglacials essentially. And so there's dates associated with the coastal dune limestone at about 1.8, 1.3, 0.5 and 0.1 million years. And each of those distinctive phases of formation of dune limestone has a soil horizon associated with it. Yeah, and along the south coast, there are some granitic outcrops. The best known of those are the Remarkable Rocks, which are a honeypot for all the tourists that come to the island, and also Cape Willoughby at the eastern extremity of the island. There's a lighthouse there that's been there since 1852, and it's one of the places all the tourists have to go to. In terms of how the island formed, and I'll keep this pretty brief, essentially we're talking 600 million years ago. So at that stage, so of course, Australia looked nothing like it does today. To the west of where Kangaroo Island is now was a large landmass, the Gawler Craton, basically granitic rocks, Proterozoic age, in excess of 1 billion years old. And to the east of that was a deep ocean trench. And over time, a lot of fine sandy material was washing into that ocean trench. And that was happening all the way from Kangaroo Island right up into the southern Flinders Ranges. So it was a massive feature to the east of that land mass. And over time, a lot of sediment washed into that, and the depression of the crust caused by that accumulation of sediment weakened the crust. And so we have a line of essentially granite intrusions coming up through the crust. And that's the basis of the these little pockets of granite along the south coast of Kangaroo Island, which are all around about between 400 and 450 million years old. At a later stage, with the uplift of the Flinders Ranges, there was folding and faulting. We can identify four phases of that. On the far west coast of Kangaroo, you can actually see the anticlinal folds very well exposed. Okay, so the actual South Australian georegister. At the moment, it's about 21 on the register from Kangaroo Island. There's the Cambrian sedimentary rocks and metamorphics and some fossils. There's some good examples of Permian glaciated pavements. There's some Jurassic basalt and there's some Holocene dune fields. The photos of an interesting little spot on the far northwest tip of the island at Harvey's Return, just down from the Cape Border Lighthouse. This little cove is where the lighthouse keepers were resupplied every 3 months from Adelaide. And there's these wonderfully contorted Cambrian metasediments there, we call sort of zebra rock. Rather nice. So just to run through the sites that are actually on the register, so the oldest rocks are actually Proterozoic metamorphic rocks that are only in one spot at Snapper Point, which is on the northeastern coast of the island, not very far from the Dudley Winery, if you want to combine viticulture and geology. It's quite good. And you can actually, so it's basically metamorphic rocks with basalt dikes running through. And you can find exactly the same formation in the Vestfold Hills of Antarctica. So the two obviously were conjoined until about 40 million years ago when Australia and Antarctica split apart. The Cambrian sediments and fossils, particularly trilobite fossils, are exposed at a number of sites, both on the north coast and the west coast of the island. Particularly interesting bedding. The fossil sites have been investigated by teams from Adelaide University. Very good exposures of trilobites. That's well worth a look. The Cambrian granites that I mentioned before, the best known being Remarkable Rocks, but a whole lot of different sites along the south coast. Then the Permian shales and glaciated pavements are around about roughly 280 million, 300 million years old. At that stage, of course, there was movement of glacial ice from southeast to northwest, and that basically scoured out the backstairs passage between the mainland and Kangaroo Island. And you can today see glacial striations at a number of sites at Smith Bay and Christmas Cove, just near Penishore, one of the towns on the island. And at Boxing Bay, on the north coast of the island, there's a boulder beach, and there are these bar fridge-sized granite boulders, which are beautifully rounded and polished by glacial transport, which have come from Cape Willoughby, about 70 kilometres to the southeast. So that's kind of nice. Some nice basalt exposures just in the town of Kingscote, the old government quarry. Some little bits and pieces of Eocene limestone, also at Kingscote, and then a whole lot of different exposures of dune limestone, the Pleistocene dune limestone. So, so that's more or less what's on the register at the moment, and there's obviously scope to increase that quite dramatically. So, a couple of existing sites that are of relevance to caves and karst. Admiral's Arch at the southwestern extremity of the island at Cape Takuti. It's essentially a sea cave in Pleistocene dune limestone sitting over the top of gently dipping Cambrian metasandstones. There's a raised beach inside the cave, which has been dated to about 122,000 years, so lasting glacial age. So that works. And there's also shore platforms which are at the same level as that, around that stretch of the coast. There's also a rather nice long-nosed fur seal colony there, which about this time of year is breeding season, so you can go and watch the seal pups cavorting around in the surf, having a lovely time. Remarkable Rocks, it's a little bit further east from there. The granite there is about 500 million years old. There was some deformation of that rock about 400 million years ago, and there's xenoliths, foreign rocks of metasandstone that have somehow got incorporated into the granite about that time. Some rather nice classic tors and other forms of exfoliation and granite weathering. Also Tophony, because the area is very exposed to sea spray, so there's quite a lot of solution of the granite by sea spray. You get these rather interesting forms, and there's also solution runnels there. I think there might be, yes, it's a good example of solution runnels formed by sea spray running down the rocks. So that's one of the if you're only doing the one-day tour of Kangaroo Island, that's one of the sites to which you'll be taken. So now moving to the far northwestern corner of the island at Rivendell. It's a pretty nice stretch of coast and fully exposed. was first mapped by Nicholas Baudin and his scientific exploring expedition in 1803. It's a great place to go bushwalking, and we've been also finding caves there. So this is looking up the ravine itself and then inside the cave. So yes, Baudin was there. He completely mapped the island. His cartographers were Freycinet and Boulanger. They did a very good job of mapping the whole island, and they named a large number of features after notable French people of the day. So they called Carta or Kangaroo Island Ile de Cray. De Cray was actually the French Minister of Marine at the time, so it didn't hurt to curry a bit of favour with those in authority. At a later stage, some sailors were shipwrecked there in 1815 and spent 6 months there before they were rescued, and they carved all sorts of inscriptions on the rocks, which are more or less the lines of "Get me out of here, please." And there are quite a lot of flank margin caves along that stretch of coast. Essentially, you get accelerated solution of the limestone at the junction of freshwater and seawater. And so you get some quite nice caves. And these are tending to form at several levels, up to about 35 metres above present sea level. One of the projects we'd like to get going is actually doing some speleothem dating in those different levels of caves, because we think it probably relates to uplift of the island. So we get some uplift rates that way. So now looking at some new sites. Surprisingly, the Kelly Hill Caves, which is the main tourist cave site on the island, is not on the South Australian Heritage List. I don't know how that happened. So we're going to try and sort that out. Very nicely decorated series of caves in the dune limestone. They're very important for marsupial fossils, and they're also very important for paleoclimate studies. Both Russell Drysdale has been doing some work there, and some of his past PhD students, I think Helen Green worked there, and we've got some ongoing projects there at the moment. Yes, so we have some drip counters in several places in the caves. We're looking at collecting drip water that's percolating down through the limestone to understand its isotopic composition, and we're hoping that we might be able to pick up a bushfire signal in the isotopes from last year. And we've also got a cave climate recording project, which is part of the project set up last year by the Australasian Cave Management Association. So we've got 27 caves in Australia and New Zealand instrumented for temperature and humidity, and we're looking to see how that varies with seasonal conditions, with airflows, and with visitor impacts. And, so that's going to be an ongoing project for the next few years. As part of that, the bushfire burnt out the whole of Kelly Hill. Very intense fire. We had an aluminium ladder poking out of one of the entrances to the tourist caves that melted in the bushfire, and we're looking up the data. We found that you need to get 800 degrees Celsius to melt that particular aluminium type. So it's pretty hot. We've flown LiDAR over the area. It was done in collaboration with Flinders Uni. This is just a hillshade version of the LiDAR data. George Hacker from Flinders has got an ultralight with a LiDAR pod on it. So I've had him down there flying that. And we've also been doing drone photography over the area. And so we identify potential karst features, which are the bits in red on that map. And then we've got an arrangement with the South Australian speleologists from Adelaide we bring them over periodically and let them loose with a GPS and say, just go and tell us what's there. So it's great fun. So we've now mapped about 56 new caves at Kelly Hill. As a result of this, we're now expanding that program onto the western end of the island, which is virtually unknown as far as caves go. So now we're back on the western end of the island. This is West Bay to the right. That's Vanica Point. The Loch Vanica was a Scottish grain ship, square rigged ship that one night crashed into that headland in 1905 during a storm. Debris from it was spread all along the south coast of Kangaroo Island. There were no survivors. More recently, some of the local divers have gone down into those waters and found a lot of artefacts from that shipwreck. There are about 68 different shipwrecks around Kangaroo Island. It was not a good place to be caught on a lee shore in a heavy sea. Yeah, it gives you a bit of an idea of the landscape there. And just to the north of West Bay, we've got the Vanica Point sea cave. So the cave's actually in Cambrian sandstone, but it's got a capping of Dune limestone, which you can see there. It's about a 60-metre drop to the floor, abseil in, and at the bottom there's big rounded marine boulders, and you can actually go through a narrow cleft and come out in that gulch that you can see in the photo on the lower left. So it's kind of an interesting feature. We think we can identify from the LiDAR, which we've just flown over that area. There's about another half a dozen things like that we can see and haven't got to yet. This is the Cape Dutton Sea Cave. This is on the north coast, about halfway along. It's on private property. A friend of mine owns the farm. So it's the base of a 60-metre cliff in Dune limestone. And it's essentially, it's a sea cave, goes in about 80 metres into the cliff. It's plus 6 metres, so it's pretty certain to be of last interglacial age, about 120,000 years ago. And yeah, it's got a boulder beach at the back of the cave. So it's a really interesting site. That big ledge there has got a sea eagle nest on it, who are quite defensive of their site. They've been nesting there for at least the last 40 years. To get to the cave, you've actually got to climb down this cliff, and with an eagle flying around you, it's a bit interesting at times. But anyway, so it's a lovely little cave. This is up Western Cove, which is further along towards the northwestern tip of the island. This is where the Snelling Fault, the big thrust fault I've mentioned before, comes out to the coast. So essentially you've got the basement rock there is the Cambrian sandstone, and then you've got this overlying sandstones and meta sandstones, and the faults made the whole thing go like that, crunch over itself. So you get these sea caves there, which developed in the actual fault zone itself. So bits and pieces are falling off all the time. And there's quite a nice little penguin colony in one of the caves. I should say that there used to be a lot of penguins on the island, and then with the increase in the fur seal population, they like to eat penguins. And so the poor penguins are sort of on the decline at the moment. Oh yeah. So this is Boar Beach. This is on the southeastern side of the Dudley Peninsula, south coast of the island. Again, this is another site that's on private property. And these are trace fossils of late Pleistocene megafauna, which were discovered by the property owner, Mark. and his wife June, and they met them somewhere at a meeting, and they said, "You know what? Come and have a look at this." Okay. So you can see the dune limestone there. It's beautifully layered dune limestone that's lithified, and there's this apron at the base of it, which extends for about 100 metres or so along the coast. And that apron contains the footprints of a lot of megafauna. So it's taken TL dates from above and below that layer. It's been 135, 37,000. So the last interglacial at the end of that cold. And presumably sea level was very rapidly. And the animals that are represented by the tracks are Diprotodon, Stenurus, the deep-faced browsing kangaroo, or possibly Protodon, thylacines, and various kangaroos, possums, and goannas. So that just gives you an idea of what some of the tracks look like. These tracks here are Protodon, and that's an illustration of it by Jan Savak from the Czech Museum, who does rather nice illustrations. And the Diprotodon, which marsupial tapir, weighed in at about 2 tonnes, stood about 1.5 metres high roughly, and that's the Diprotodon footprints there. And what else we got here? Oh yeah, and of course thylacine footprints as well. One of the interesting parts of that site is you can see there's one spot where it's obviously a lot of different animals have been congregating, and they come up to a slightly curved line just like that. And we figure it was actually a pool of fresh water at the base of the dune, and all these animals were coming in there to drink 135,000 years ago. Flowercast Bay on the south coast, south of American River where I live. Some rather nice sea cliffs with flank margin caves, some sea stacks and some big limestone pavements. There actually was a whaling station there in the early 19th century, despite the fact that Kangaroo Island wasn't officially settled by whitefellas until 1836. There were actually American, French and some British sealers and whalers there from about 1803 onwards. In this location, they had a couple of big flower casks painted white up on poles to guide people in, and was an anchorage there. So that's the Bridgewater Formation dune limestone overlying an older mid-Pleistocene Cape Hart limestone, which forms the pavement there in the lower right. That's a much more consolidated limestone. Okay, so we've got a range of different geoheritage sites around the island, and there's potential to find quite a few more. One of the things we're looking at the moment is the concept of geotrails, the idea that we can define a journey that people might like to take, or a number of sites along a route, and give people experiences of geotourism. The linkages would be through the area's geology and landscapes, and basically providing some enjoyment and some education and engaging them. There's a couple of examples in southwestern Victoria and southeast and South Australia. You've got the Kanawinka area, which was proposed for a geopark along the same lines. Didn't find favour with the federal government because they saw it as, quote, locking away more country in some form of national park. So that sort of didn't go down too well. So now we're looking at geotrails as an alternative to get around the federal government. But basically you can, define a number of precincts around there with common themes in either volcanic landforms or in limestone landforms. The lower right is the Ascent Geopark in northwest Scotland, where there's a number of geotrails that are related to the geological history of that area and the history of science over the 18th and 19th centuries. And that's a much visited site. It's also a global geopark, and it's quite an important tourism site for Scotland. Okay, moving on to the bushfires. So from about mid-December 2019 through to the end of the first week of January 2020, Kangaroo Island was on fire. Roughly 200,000 hectares were burnt over about a week. So this map by burn law, burnt areas are in kind of rusty red colour. So you can see there's a pretty fair sort of dividing line. And let's give you some examples. So that's remarkable rocks before and after the fire. Basically all the infrastructure was destroyed, and it's actually coming back remarkably well. And I was out there a few weeks ago. So essentially about 95 or 96% of Flinders Chase National Park was burnt. Very high losses of wildlife, despite significant efforts to try and treat injured marsupials and to eradicate feral cats, which were preying on the survivors. We unfortunately lost 2 of the firefighters, nearly 90 houses, about 60,000 sheep, and hundreds of kilometres of fences. At Kelly Hill, virtually the entire area was burnt. We lost all of the above ground infrastructure, and there was quite a lot of damage to the surface limestone and a lot of soil and charcoal washing into the caves. And the drainage to the north of the cave was also partially diverted and partially blocked the water entries into the limestone. It is coming back quite well. Here's a couple of before and after. The before shots on the left from September 2020 and the current situation there. There's quite a lot of good regrowth of the vegetation, and there's quite a diversity. We thought that initially that the all the soil seed bank would be totally sterilised by the heat, but it wasn't. There's quite a lot coming back, which is good. It will be different for sure, but at least there's good ground cover coming back. So in terms of what we've been up to, we're having a lot of input into the new Western Kangaroo Island Park Management Plan, which is due to be completed in a few weeks' time, and a process of reimagining of the nature-based tourism in the parks on the island. So it's provided, in some sense, a golden opportunity to rethink what should be done on the island. We formed a Friends of the Karst group earlier this year, and we get support from the South Australian Park Service for that. They're coming, they churn $20,000 or $30,000 a year to support activities on ground in the limestone areas. We're continuing our cave documentation and mapping, so we've got trips planned for every month this year with financial support from the South Australian Park Service for accommodation and transport and everything like that. We're developing the Geotrail idea, identifying a number of key sites around the island, and then we're going to build an app with interpretive material, and that will be in several languages, so that visitors, as we hope, international tourism starts to come back, if it ever does, we'll have interpretive material in several languages. And also developing more specialist cave tours and guided walks in the limestone areas on the island. That's it. Any questions?
Lists of particularities of caves that are important in our centric way with fire is valued so in these cases it might be geologically innocuous and not here on our list might be vice versa. So could you comment a little bit about what's happening?
Yeah, it's one thing that has helped is actually a number of people have moved across the island to play in the AFL league there. So we've actually got people that are actually now resident on the island. That's a good way of keeping that dialogue going. At the time of when the Europeans first arrived, there were that's just simply not true. We've got a number of rock shelter sites that are dated between 3,000 and 4,000 years old, and more recently some rock shelter sites and some open sites on the south coast of the island, which are only 300 or 400 years old. So people were clearly using the landscape. And I guess I know the people from the Park Service on the island really have the responsibility of engaging with Indigenous people, people who have an interest in the island, and that is happening slowly. One of the things I've been involved in recently is revisions to the Aboriginal Heritage Act in South Australia, which was 1972. And you read that, and it's a dreadful piece of colonial. And so there's a whole lot of things that need to happen with that revision of the legislation. People's access to land, they have to go through South Australia and New Zealand, and that information is very, very hard to access. So that's got to change, and that's got to be a process of engagement. We're probably talking almost generation. The interesting thing is one of them, Malagalena, is the sister of Truganina. She was brought to the island by a guy called Nat Thomas, who was a sealer and a whaler, and he eventually settled on the island, and they had a tribe of kids, as you do, and so there's a whole interesting history to be teased out there of what happened to the women who were brought, some willingly, some unwillingly, to Kangaroo Island and to the Bass Strait Islands as well.
There's a question from online. Sorry, it says, were the caves formed before or after the sea level rise? If it is the former, can you estimate the uplift rate?
The answer probably to that, both before and after sea level, because you've got multiple sea level rises over the last 2 million years. So it's an almost continuous process. At this stage, I would hesitate to estimate an uplift rate, but it's got to be significant. I'm used to working in parts of Australia which have been tectonically stable for a very, very long time. That's pretty well most of the coast. And you come to a place like Kangaroo Island, all of a sudden it's obvious that there's been a lot of recent uplift. And there is too on the southern end of the Fluria Peninsula, south of Adelaide.
You've got that big fault running down sort of east-west fault across the island. Is there any evidence of ternary offsets of the limestones along that fault?
Possibly, yes.
So you'd be able to kind of
Possibly along that north coast area. Cape Cassini, along that stretch of coast, and further west, there's a sizable chunk of dune limestone along there, and there is definitely some kind of terracing along there now. It's too high up to be anything to do with you know, relatively recent sea level change. So yeah, I would be looking along there, along that stretch of north coast from Stokes Bay east, roughly, and probably some of the areas along the south coast west of Destries Bay, running along to Bond Bay. Yeah.
Thanks, Dave. Two quick questions. I think the first one, did the fires make it easier to find sites?
Yes. We had a funny experience just on the south coast, a place called Sunsville Boom, of the river, and one of the local residents found this cave with a pile of what he thought were seal skins in it. And these had obviously been there for a very, very long time. And went back there, and it turned out there weren't seal skins, they were possum skins. But the initial thought was that it was actually probably an Aboriginal occupation site, but subsequently found out that it was actually a local resident, a woman called Tilka, who was living there in the 1930s and actually made her money out of selling possum skins to people on the mainland for making felt hats. And this was one of her acacias. She would put them in there in a relatively dry, sheltered environment until she had enough to sell and make some money. So yeah, we're finding lots of sites quite easily, and that will continue as long as the vegetation allows us to.
The second question was with Neville Rosenberg yesterday, who did the sites of geological and geomorphic significance of Victoria, and this was about 30 years ago, and he was just bemoaning yesterday that there's really no vehicle or a mechanism for protecting a lot of those, particularly on private land, and so he's just seeing them all disappear progressively despite being identified. So how are you going to protect all of these, or at least recognise them?
Yeah, well, it's less problematic for sites that are actually in National Park or Conservation Reserve, which is a significant number. I mean, the rest perhaps would involve some kind of conservation covenant with local landholders. And certainly they're not averse to the idea. You know, if they had to basically sequester a small section of the property for that purpose. I mean, one of the big problems is that there doesn't seem to be any real appetite from the federal government. I mean, the Federal Environment Department and the Heritage Section has the responsibility for managing the National Heritage List. There's about 100 sites on that at the moment, but they're essentially all cultural heritage. There's not that many natural heritage sites on there. And we've had various attempts to get sites onto that list, and they go into the bottom drawer all the time. So I've been trying to get the Mitchell, Palmer and Chillago casts in North Queensland on the National Heritage List since 2006.
That would seem a completely obvious thing to do.
Yes, and that's a necessary precursor for getting anything listed as a global geopark or indeed as World Heritage. So we need to have a really big change in attitude from the relevant federal minister. I don't see that happening, unfortunately.
But how do the states vary in their protection of geoheritage? Like is South Australia better than other states?
Oh, well, they would think so. South Australia is certainly more sensitive to Indigenous rights. For example, the Canal de Cave on the Nullarbor, access to that is totally restricted. You can only go in there with the approval of the elders of the Learning community. One of the South Australian cavers, who's also a geologist, has been negotiating for 4 years to set up an ecotourism operation there with the Murnian people to be able to take small groups of visitors in there under quite strict controls. And that looks like it's going to happen. The present Liberal government in South Australia, the Minister, David Spears, seems to have a pretty good attitude towards the environment. He's definitely pro-tourism and certainly gives lip service to the advantages of ecotourism. So I'd say it's not too bad. Western Australia, you have the Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions. Pretty well sums it up. Queensland, well, there is no Queensland representative on the Geological Society's Geoheritage Commission and hasn't been for a very long time. And there's really no activity happening at a state government level about geoheritage or geoconservation. Tasmania stands out as excellent, and they've really been driving things along, and they've done some excellent work down there. So, sort of answers your question.
I think we're going to wrap it up there unless anyone has any questions.
Just one more quick question. The obviously the fire, you were saying the fire has washed all this charcoal and sediment into some of these caves. Presumably there's some fairly substantial sediment traps in those caves. Anybody look to see the extent to which that fire has increased them?
Yes, Gavin Prideaux from South Australia has been looking at mainly at the marsupial sites in the Kelly Hill Caves. There's been picking up fire layers, and I guess one of the projects I know Russell Drysdale would like to do is to take some sections through some flowstones and see if you can actually pick up discrete charcoal layers. Exactly, yeah. So there is good potential to do that.
Thank you so much. That's really cool.